Hi, everyone. Welcome to the panel on innovation and decarbonizing our hard to electrify sectors. Thank you so much for joining us today here at National Clean Energy Week. My name is Abigail Rajitsky, and I'll be your moderator for today. I am a manager on the U.S. Policy and Advocacy team at Breakthrough Energy, and I focus on industrial decarbonization and carbon management. If you're not familiar with Breakthrough, we are a network of philanthropic, investment and advocacy initiatives, all focused on getting the technologies we need to get to net zero by 2050. So I'm really excited to moderate this discussion today because I think it fits really well with BE's mission. You know, we absolutely need to accelerate deployment of existing climate solutions like solar, wind, transmission, electric vehicles. But equally important is to ensure we're innovating and developing the technology we need for 2035, 2050, and really beyond that. So, cleaning up the grid, electrifying everything that we can is going to get us a lot of the way to net zero. But we need really a full suite of solutions to really tackle industries like the industrial sector, heavy transport, agriculture, other hard to abate sectors. Um, Excited that the administration is doing their part in trying to help in this front. DOE has released their industrial decarbonization roadmap, just launched their six energy earthshot on industrial heat, which is really exciting. And we just heard, from Tricia Miller at the White House, who talked a lot about kind of the procurement pieces that are going to be really important as well in building demand. And of course, Congress is also taking a lot of action in this space, which is really exciting. Three bills over the last several months: the infrastructure law, CHIPS and Science, as well as, of course, the Inflation Reduction Act, have a ton of investments that are really going to help all of these sectors. But implementation is going to be really critical. So this is just a bit of what I think the panel is going to jump into today. And with that, I'd love to introduce our panelists. So we have BJ Johnson, CEO of Clear Flame Engine Technologies, Petra Smeltzer, Executive Director of Heatis Power Association, Dan Byers, Vice President, Climate and Technology at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and Rick Murphy, Managing Director, Energy Markets at the American Gas Association. So welcome to all our panelists. We're going to jump right in and get into the discussion, but we will have time for audience Q&A at the end. So please start submitting those questions anytime they come up, and we'll get to those towards the end of the session. So, first question for you all. Your companies and organizations are all working in these hard to electrify or difficult to decarbonize sectors. Love to learn more about the solutions you and your members are excited about. So, BJ, why don't we start with you? Clear Flame is focusing on decarbonizing heavy duty transport, particularly diesel engines. Can you tell us a bit more about Clear Flame, how your engine technology is reducing emissions while maintaining performance?
Absolutely. Thank you, Abigail, and thank you everyone for having me in ClearFlame here today. ClearFlame's thesis is that the movement towards electrification is critically important, but there are hard to electrify sectors out there, and it's not just the industrial ones. And I would take it one step forward. It's not just long haul trucking, but there's a lot of diesel applications that are hard to electrify: agriculture and construction, power generators, marine and rail. So ClearFlame's thesis is, rather than have to reinvent the wheel, what is the minimum subset of changes that we can make to a diesel engine to make it fundamentally fuel agnostic? So ClearFlame, we are taking engines today, we are retrofitting them where we have to change maybe 10, 15% of the parts. We're also working with big industrial OEMs to make this a new OEM product. And we've been able to show that with our modifications, you can get all of the performance and practicality from these engines, leverage why they've come to dominate the applications that they have today, but run them on a range of decarbonized liquid fuels. That includes things like methanol and ammonia in the long term. And in the near term, it includes fuels like ethanol that we already have 17 billion gallons of in this country. And we've been able to prove with our technology, with customers, that we can not only help them meet their sustainability goals, we can do so in a way that really minimizes any sort of required behavior change on the part of user, which lowers adoption hurdles. And I think most importantly, leverages economics by using infrastructure that largely already exists and fuels that are already cheaper than diesel. So how do we align sustainability with economic value? we think that's the fastest way to practically drive climate change reductions in these hard to electrify sectors.
Thanks, BJ. Great to hear a little bit more about the technology you all are working on. Let's go to Petra next. So the Heat is Power Association primarily works in the industrial sector. One of the reasons industry is often considered hard to decarbonize or electrify is the high temperature needs for a lot of the processes. How is waste to heat or waste heat to power harnessing industrial heat to reduce emissions? Who are your members and where do they fit into the value chain?
Hi, thank you so much. I'm Petra Smeltzer, Executive Director for Heat is Power Association. And Heat is Power, or HIP, as we like to call it, represents the waste heat to power industry, which includes technology manufacturers, distributors, and project developers. Waste heat to power, WHP systems, are proven technologies that harness wasted thermal energy, and that is heat that would otherwise be vented into the atmosphere, and it's used to drive turbines or engines that can produce scalable clean power. And this electricity can either be used on site to be consumed by heavy industry or be exported into the electrical grid. Waste heat to power systems primarily use either the steam Rankine cycle or the organic Rankine cycle to transfer energy from waste heat to a working fluid. A consistent source of heat is used to evaporate water or organic fluid, and then it's pushed through a turbine or expander to produce the rotational energy needed to generate electricity. So lower temps can now be used with ORC, but it's still too hot for people, for humans, but it can go as low as 200 degrees Fahrenheit to 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit. SRC, steam Rankine cycle, and organic Rankine cycle processes are all achieved with no additional combustion and zero incremental carbon emissions. And waste heat to power is most often used in industrial applications, mostly the economy driving industries like steel and iron and cement, and then petroleum, natural gas compressor stations, glass, any of the heavy industries. But opportunities also exist in institutional buildings, commercial operations, and district energy systems. Well, to sum up, waste heat to power is a clean energy technology. It produces no new emissions from the use of waste heat, and it displaces electricity produced from carbon-based fuels. We recently commissioned a study by ICF International. It's a renowned think tank, and ICF International concluded that waste heat to power has the same emissions profile as wind and PV solar. So, in short, waste heat to power can play a key role as part of the clean power transition. As we all know, there's a growing market demand for zero emission power. And as intermittent zero emission sources like solar and wind gain a larger share of the grid, zero emission base load will become progressively more critical. And that's where waste heat to power can become an essential, one of the essential solutions.
Thanks, Petra. Great to hear a bit more on how these heavy industries and other sectors can, be part of that solution. Dan, let's turn to you. What about the chamber? Who are some of the key members in hard to abate sectors? And what technologies are they looking to address the decarbonization challenge?
Thanks, Abigail. And I think everyone's probably familiar with the Chamber of Commerce, and our membership is as broad as it can get across the economy. And so, as we look at this, one of the things we fundamentally point out of the gate is just as we look at policy and technology to address hard to abate sectors, that we have to recognize the diversity in the sheer number of different sectors. BJ and Petra both touched on this a little bit. I'm going to sound like I'm plugging something right out of the gate, but we put together a chart that we call the long tail of economy-wide GHG emissions, and it simply shows that diversity. Typically, when you look at GHG sources, we put them into six categories: simplified, power sector, industrial, transportation, commercial, residential, and agriculture. But of course, each one of those are not monolithic and have many subsectors. And so what we did is break out everywhere that EPA tracks, and there are 76 different sources that make up the economy-wide totals where we are at 6 gigatons. And we mention that because as you look down through all of them, each one is going to have a different solution. And by the way, just kind of an interesting thing, when we use this term that we call the long tail, everyone understands passenger vehicles and coal and natural gas power plants, which are the three largest categories. And those largest categories comprise over half of economy-wide emissions. Well, the other 73 categories comprise the other half. And so it's just a nice way to illustrate that we're going to need a lot of different tools in the toolbox as we tackle this. And so, Abigail, you mentioned the DOE industrial decarbonization roadmap that came out, I think, a week or two ago. And I think that does a nice job of kind of pointing out that there's no silver bullet. We're going to need hydrogen, CCUS, energy efficiency, electrification to some degree, biofuels, et cetera. And it's important, again, to recognize that, what might work for cement and steel may not work for glass or other of these many, many different sectors. And so I think that's the kind of first fundamental point I'd make.
Thanks, Dan. Looking forward to taking a look at that chart you all put together. Sounds like a great resource for our audience. Rick, let's turn to you. Can you tell us a bit more about the American Gas Association, your members, and how they're working with sectors they serve to decarbonize?
Sure. Thanks, Abigail, and thank you for the opportunity to participate on the panel today. We have a really diverse group of panelists and looking forward to the conversation. For those who aren't familiar with the American Gas Association, we represent more than 200 local energy companies that deliver natural gas throughout the United States. There are more than 76 million residential, commercial, and industrial natural gas customers in the country, of which 95% of them, or more than 72 million customers, receive their gas from AGA members. Today, natural gas meets more than 30% of the United States energy needs. I've been part of AGA for about 10 years now, and since joining AGA, my primary role has been really focused to work with our members to build the value proposition of gas utilities in a low-carbon energy future. This includes the industry's continued commitment to delivering energy efficiency programs to its customers across all sectors, developing and deploying next-generation, highly efficient end-use technologies, and finally, advancing low-carbon gas resources like renewable natural gas and hydrogen. AGA and its members understand and appreciate the need to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions across all sectors of the economy. In 2020, AGA issued its climate change position statement and articulated 10 collective commitments towards achieving a significantly lower carbon energy economy and 8 principles for policy action. The principles call out the importance for all sectors to contribute to environmental goals, the need for decarbonization programs to be flexible, and the importance of recognizing the contributions of all solutions providers, including gas utilities. To further advance our emissions reductions contributions and to ensure that climate solutions leveraging gas infrastructure can be given proper consideration as part of a broader climate planning initiatives, earlier this year, AGA released a comprehensive analysis exploring natural gas pathways to achieve net zero emissions. The study, Net Zero Emissions Opportunities for Gas Utilities, presents a national level approach that leverages the unique advantages of gas technologies and the gas distribution infrastructure. The study underscores the range of scenarios and technology opportunities available as a nation, the regions of the country, states, and even communities develop and implement ambitious emissions reduction plans. The high-level findings from the study include that gas utilities and gas infrastructure can play crucial and enduring roles when building pathways to achieve a net zero energy future. Secondly, using a range of different approaches and technologies, like you've heard from some of the panelists already, gas utilities can meet net zero greenhouse gas emissions targets, and the appropriate mix of measures will probably vary by region and probably by utility. Third, the ability of gas infrastructure to store and transport large amounts of energy to meet seasonal and peak energy use represents an important and valuable resource that needs to be considered when building pathways to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions goals. And finally, continued utilization of gas infrastructure can increase the likelihood of successfully reaching net zero targets while minimizing customer impacts. So I'm pleased again to have the opportunity to be part of today's panel discussion and discuss some of the innovative solutions for achieving emissions reductions in the industrial and all other sectors. So I'll turn it back over to you, Abigail, at this point.
Thanks, Rick, and thanks to all the panelists for giving us a bit of an intro into who you are and your companies and member organizations. So let's jump right into what everyone's thinking about right now, policy implementation. So a historic set of legislation has passed that provides unprecedented investment to develop and deploy clean energy and climate technologies, the Infrastructure Innovation and Jobs Act, the CHIPS and Science Act, and the Inflation Reduction Act. R&D support, billions for demonstrations, tax incentives for both emissions reductions as well as clean manufacturing, so we can, build the technologies here. I'd love to hear from each of you which are the provisions that are going to make the biggest impacts for your industries, and what we need to get right on implementation to make sure that the money, goes out the door efficiently and effectively. So Petra, why don't we start with you? How is waste heat to power benefiting from these bills?
Oh, thank you. Mostly from the investment tax credit that was extended in the IRA. The investment tax credit for WERP, as they refer to WHP, WERP stands for Waste Energy Recovery Product, was first initiated in 2021. No, I'm sorry, 2020. So it's still new, but we were really grateful that it was extended, and we received a 30% investment tax credit on par with other renewable energy sources. Um, that has really opened the door for a lot of market penetration. Um, Recently, entities have started to uh, become much more interested in waste heat to power systems because they do require a pretty significant capital outlay, and the investment tax credit makes it much more incentivizes investing in such things in this technology, along with a lot of environmental social goals in corporate and shareholder. Uh, what's the word I'm looking for? At any rate, shareholders want their corporations to invest in technologies that meet an ESG goals, and so this does fit within that as well. So I would say mostly it's the ITC.
Great, thanks, Petra. Good to hear that that's already starting to make a difference for folks wanting to adopt waste heat to power. Dan, let's go to you next. Which provisions are you closely following?
Yeah, sure. So, well, we're trying to follow them all because that's where the chamber, and we have kind of a broad remit, and just the sheer number of provisions and really their magnitude is a bit overwhelming. But I'm sure in the coming weeks and months the dust will settle. But I'll just flag a couple that come to mind. And actually spent last week in Pittsburgh for the Global Clean Energy Action Forum and the Clean Energy Ministerial, and it was. The buzz there was palpable, I think, in terms of all the different programs and provisions that have come out of the recent laws. two that I think really heard the most about, especially with respect to hard to abate sectors, is one, 45Q, the enhanced 45Q tax credit has been increased from $50 a ton to $85 a ton for carbon capture and sequestration. And I think there's a feeling that that's really going to be a sort of a threshold value that's going to catalyze a good deal of investment in new projects. So that's something to watch. And then maybe even more interesting is the new hydrogen production tax credit, which is 45V. I think 45Q is a household name. I have a feeling 45V, as in Victor, is going to be a household name pretty soon too, and that would provide a tax credit of up to $3 per kilogram of hydrogen, depending on the life cycle GHG inputs into that. And so I think that the sense, at least that we're hearing and seeing, is that that is going to catalyze an awful lot of investment production on the supply side, and it's really attractive and exciting because hydrogen, we think of it as kind of the Swiss Army knife of decarbonization. There's just so many different applications and tools, from transportation to all sorts of industry to electric power, et cetera. And so I think the hope is that it's a little bit of a, if you build it, they will come. And so with that substantial credit, you're going to get a lot of new hydrogen supply online, and then hopefully there'll be some offtake demand that will come from that, from all these other sectors that are trying to look at their pathways. So, and I would flag on top of that, those credits are often stackable. They aren't, 45Q and 45V are not stackable, but for example, the wind PTC, the ITC is stackable with that hydrogen PTC, so you can get double incentives there, and as well as there's a new nuclear production tax credit of 1.5 cents per kilowatt hour. And so I think that's actually one to watch that really nobody is talking about, is pink hydrogen, which really can fit a lot of great niches. And the fact that you can claim both the nuclear PTC and the hydrogen benefits there, I think, is also going to stimulate a lot of investment activity in terms of the private sector response to this legislation.
Thanks, Dan. Rick, maybe we'll go to you next. Dan already mentioned, the hydrogen tax credit. You mentioned that that's something that your members are also looking at. What other things are you looking at? Are your members looking at pursuing in these kind of three bills?
Yeah, as you mentioned, quite a few that Dan already mentioned. On the IIJA, there are a couple of key areas that we're keenly interested in. The $3.5 billion in weatherization assistance programs is really important for the ability to improve the efficiency of existing buildings. And so that has been a real challenge in the efficiency area for many years, is these deep retrofits that enable us to allow those buildings to be much more efficient. So that's really important. Another component of the IIJA was the $2.5 billion going to grid infrastructure resilience and reliability. I think it's really important, as we're focusing on this critical objective of achieving decarbonization goals, that we do not lose sight about the importance of energy system resilience. And quite honestly, if we don't have energy system resilience, what are the potential implications of that, particularly as we're seeing more and more severe weather events that are impacting the energy system. So really pleased that we saw some attention to resilience in the Infrastructure Act, and we're hoping in future, and we'll get to that, we're hoping future policy will continue to drive home the importance of energy system resilience. On the IRA legislation, again, we're very pleased with the piece of legislation, Section 13102, that was referenced earlier, about the investment tax credit for waste heat to power and combined heat and power solutions. It extends that investment tax credit for a couple of years. We are very supportive of that. But also part of that legislation was an investment tax credit for renewable natural gas facilities. And the first time that has been introduced, and really starting to provide that incentive to build out the infrastructure for renewable natural gas. We've seen tremendous increases in the use of renewable natural gas in RNG production facilities, primarily driven by policy in the transportation sector. That has been fantastic. It's been a catalyst for advancing RNG, but this expands that beyond just looking at RNG for the transportation sector. It allows it across all sectors. Similarly, we're very pleased that not only just in the IRA legislation, but other policies that have emerged that is really keenly focused on building out the hydrogen market. Obviously, as a distributor of energy to the local markets, we're very interested in how do we decarbonize our gas pipeline. One of those key opportunities through the use of hydrogen and using our gas infrastructure to the extent we can to transport hydrogen to the end use sectors. So we're really pleased about the production tax credit in Section 13204. And then finally, not directly related to our members' business, but certainly related to our vision for a net zero energy future and the importance that carbon capture, utilization, and storage. And Section 1304 that has already been referenced that lowers the bar to achieve these incentives for carbon capture technologies, utilization, and storage, I think is really a key step forward to be able to advance that technology. Based upon what we've seen and all of the work that we've done, no matter what we're doing on the decarbonization at the end use and bringing in new fuels, carbon capture is a critical component of our pathway. So really pleased to see that emerge.
Thanks, Rick. And BJ, your perspective as a startup, I think, is really interesting in looking at, these pieces of legislation. What is ClearFlame excited to pursue, and how can it really change the game on the financial landscape for, decarbonizing heavy transport and the other sectors you're thinking about?
Certainly, yes. So being a startup, we have to have a slightly narrower focus, and I don't envy people like Dan who have to know everything that is in these bills. But there is tremendous opportunity within both IIJA and IRA to support the infrastructure to expand deployment of things like biofuels. These are fuels that have already been scaled up in terms of supply capacity in the country, which means they already have massive cost-effective decarbonization potential. And while the hurdles of deploying biofuel infrastructure are pretty low, liquid infrastructure is inexpensive, it is still non-zero. And anything that we can do working with our partner fleets and end user customers on farms and construction sites to make it even easier to move away from their traditional petroleum fuels to these lower carbon alternatives is going to be a good thing. And as I said in my opening statement, allowing them to further drive decarbonization via economics. I would also certainly point out 45Q. One of the fuels that ClearFlame uses most predominantly is ethanol. That is a fuel that has made tremendous progress in this country. Initial ethanol production was not particularly efficient, but as it stands today, it is 45 to 50% better than, say, petroleum diesel fuel in terms of life cycle GHG emissions, which makes it lower carbon than an average electric vehicle. And I don't mean that as a knock on EVs, but just like the grid needs to further decarbonize, that remains true for the ethanol sector as well. And the ethanol sector is one of the easiest industries to add carbon capture to, one of the best targets for 45Q tax credits. And it can reduce the carbon intensity of that fuel by another 30% or so every time those solutions are implemented at the plant level. So I'm very excited to see that happen as well. But the final point I would make, Abigail, you asked, how do we make sure that these funds are being deployed effectively? And I would argue that it's not just about how the funds are deployed effectively, but how that fits into the bigger picture of what's going on in the country, which is let's not lose sight of what is already out there and cost effective today. The study by the Rodian Group showed that the investments that the IRA made were strong across all sectors, but they were weakest within transportation, the incremental benefit being about 5% or so, which speaks to how much room for innovation there still is out there in this space. And so I think as an industry, both small companies like ClearFlame and the larger partners we work with, we need to communicate to users, even where there is not support for technologies within these bills, if they are already cost-effective solutions, and I would argue that cost-effective solutions don't need further government support, those can be adopted today and immediately drive those carbon reductions regardless of what support there is for in the bill. And so using the bill as an opportunity to look at the larger picture and say, what can be done both inside the bill and out of it, and how do we maximize carbon mitigation in aggregate? I think that's the big argument we need to make, and certainly one that we make to customers when we're talking about driving economic and environmental value.
Thanks, BJ. It's great to hear kind of similar themes that folks are pulling on, some of the key provisions that will impact a lot of different sectors that are in these bills. And BJ, maybe I'll turn to you again, since you mentioned kind of the modeling on kind of transport still not having as much emissions reductions. So these bills are great. We're going to focus on implementation, making sure that goes well, but we're also continue to think about what's next. So what other policies do we still need to really get to that net zero?
Absolutely. I think the single biggest one is a clean fuel standard, something modeled after the low carbon fuel standard that we have initially in California and expanded out through the West Coast of the United States. The renewable fuel standard has done a great job building a low carbon fuels infrastructure in this country. But being able to move that policy in a further fuel neutral and technology agnostic manner is going to create a rising tide that lifts all ships. Under something like a clean fuel standard, a given fuel is incentivized not based on some arbitrary choice of production pathway or maybe what the end energy carrier is, electrons versus hydrogens versus natural gas versus biofuels, but simply what is its carbon intensity. And that allows policymakers to not mandate particular solutions, but say, how does carbon intensity need to decline over time, and unleash innovation in the private sector to be able to meet those targets. So I mentioned the relative carbon intensity of EV and ethanol earlier. I think that competition is good for everyone. And under low carbon fuel standards, as both of those sectors, both the electric grid powering EVs and the ethanol that can go into clear flame trucks, decarbonize, the economic value of those products will increase. And then therefore, producers are incentivized to drive down carbon intensity in whatever way they can to deliver more economic value to those customers. And it's really by being technology agnostic and unleashing the private sector innovation in a way that perhaps policymakers might not be able to see today. That's going to be the fastest way to remain flexible towards future outcomes and really get everything working together to drive down carbon emissions across the entire economy, but certainly within transportation as quickly as we can and in a very targeted manner.
Thanks, BJ. That kind of tech neutral kind of piece of policy, I think, is so important, and something we at Breakthrough Energy certainly support. To you don't know necessarily what that new technology or invention is going to be, so making sure that the policies out there are already including that unknown, so you don't have to go back and make those changes is always important.
Absolutely.
Rick, why don't we turn to you on other policies that you think are going to still be needed?
Sure. Well, let me start first with talking about some of the implementation of the policies that we previously talked about, particularly the IRA and the IIJA, where there's massive amount of funding that are available for some of those technologies that we've been talking about. A lot of the funding will be distributed out to the individual states across the country. So the ability to work with our states to ensure that these funding sources are getting out to the states in an effective and efficient manner, and that the states are utilizing those funds in an equitable manner and a tech neutral manner, I think is going to be critical because a good percentage of the funding that's associated with this legislation is going to be distributed to the states, and the effectiveness of that is going to be how well the states and all of the stakeholders in the states can actually ensure that those funds get out and can be effective. So that's the first step. The second step, I would say, relates to what has been discussed already: technology neutral, parity across technologies and fuel sources. I think what we've seen, from my perspective, in IRA and IIJA is that it has been more equitable than previous legislation that we've seen. There's more parity across sectors. There's more parity across fuel sources. But there's room for continue to pay attention to keeping the door open for all solutions. Let's face it, achieving net zero emissions targets is going to be really, really hard. And in our view, there is no pathway or no solution that has been identified that can get us there alone. We need to keep all solutions on the table and enable us to find those solutions that can be effective in delivering our decarbonization goals. And that lends me to the third piece. And that is what I referenced earlier. We can't lose sight of, while we're pursuing decarbonization goals, although it's so critically important, we can't lose sight of energy system resilience. And we need to continue to focus to ensure that our policies that are intended to enhance both of those and achieve both of those objectives, keep in mind, how do you make sure that we're achieving both objectives and not one versus the other? So more attention to being aware of all of our key objectives, ensuring our legislation are aware of those and are progressing those collectively together. So I'd love to be able to see the continued attention to how do we continue to enhance the resilience of our energy system, our overall energy system, including gas and electric grids, and as well as other forms of energy delivery. So those would be the three key areas that I would like to be focused on as we move forward.
Thanks, Rick. Great bringing in that kind of resilience perspective as well, which is also going to continue to be important as we continue to feel climate impacts all across the country. Dan, how about you? Are you thinking about any other kind of additional policies and what's next after these three bills that have passed?
Yeah, sure. And we didn't pre-plan this, but I would just really echo what Rick and BJ said in terms of tech neutral. I was going to raise that as well. DOE and other agencies really have a massive job in front of them in terms of implementing all these programs, standing them up, et cetera. And it's not going to be easy, but I think just coming into it with these principles of being as tech neutral as possible, both within what they're implementing, but of course going forward as well. And so I think BJ made a great point on this notion of a tech neutral fuel standard. Sometimes we get so focused on EVs and they're great, but we have a lot of power sector issues right now in terms of resilience, and we may have a lot more if we go 100% EVs and we really look at the life cycle GHG emissions of transportation. It makes sense to try to do that in the most tech neutral way possible. So I would echo and endorse that. I would really just flag two others that we're watching, and probably completely obvious, but permitting reform, which is hot right now. There seems to be consensus on the need to fix a problem. We don't have consensus on the best way to do it and how narrow, et cetera, et cetera. But that's something that the chambers really arguably are top priority right now. And it goes beyond energy, but it's just difficult, of course, to build a road or construct anything, and that deters investment, economic development, et cetera. So permitting reform is a big one that Congress really does need to take up, even well beyond the current back and forth over the Manchin language. And then Farm Bill next year, and I'll be the first to say I'm not necessarily prepared to know what all the scope of provisions, but the ag sector is definitely in the hard to abate category. A lot of difficult challenges there. In fact, I know Breakthrough and Crest have both been leaders in this area, and so we're certainly looking forward to that as a vehicle that we know Congress is going to take up and put a lot of time and effort into. So we'll be watching both of those issues next year.
Thanks, Dan. Lots of great flags for our audience to keep their eye out on for what's next. So we've mostly been talking about, climate and emissions reductions, though thanks, Rick, and others for bringing resilience as well, into the conversation. But there are also other, beneficial impacts to decarbonizing. So would love to hear from all of you how the climate solutions your company and your members are developing are going to impact, other things like the US economy, jobs, and communities. What are those other benefits that you're seeing from these technologies? Petra, why don't we start with you? How is waste heat to power benefiting companies and communities?
Well, waste heat to power is a zero emission electric resource that is scalable across multiple industrial, commercial, and institutional applications. Here I'm going to use the word resilient. It provides a resilient and stable, almost 24/7 source of on site power for economy dependent industries, the ones I mentioned earlier: steel, cement. Um, those are the top two: chemicals, glass, petroleum. And it protects against grid disruptions during severe weather, wildfires, and other events that lead to grid outages. So here, waste heat to power solutions can reduce load on centralized power plants. And in other cases, waste heat to power systems produce electric power that can be sold back into the electrical grid. Earlier, I mentioned that there's a lot of focus on needing uh, renewable emission, renewable uh, intermittent, like wind and solar, for sources for electrical power. And but those are intermittent, and we'll be needing a lot more baseload types of power. And so this is where waste heat to power can come in and provide more stable and baseload power into the electrical grid. So in essence, waste heat to power is a zero emission baseload electricity that displaces electricity produced from carbon-based fuels and provides communities with economy-dependent products derived from steel, cement, and chemicals, as well as reliable electricity without producing noxious air pollution or greenhouse gas emissions, especially as more cars, lawn equipment, and devices are running on batteries. Bottom line is waste heat to power helps American manufacturers reduce energy costs, and those savings can be reinvested in their primary businesses, which helps them in turn reduce the cost of their products to ensure a reliable supply chain for customers. That's it.
Thanks, Petra. BJ, why don't we turn to you next? Can you share a bit on any on the ground examples of how ClearFlame is making an impact beyond just climate and emissions?
Yes, I was glad to hear Petra mention the noxious air pollutants. And Abigail, I don't think it's how you meant on the ground, but I think it's also important to acknowledge the local nature of emissions, not the greenhouse gases that are rightfully a big focus of the world today. We have to do something about the climate, but also criteria pollution, things like soot and smog. Where ClearFlame is based in Chicago, the south and west sides of that city, Black and brown people have a life expectancy that is about 10 years lower than that of the rest of the city. And despite what you read in the news, that is not about gun violence. It is about environmental variables. It's about the emissions that come from the industrial areas of the South Shore of Lake Michigan and the trucking routes that are running in and out of the city. And so ClearFlame, we are able to reduce not just greenhouse gas emissions, but also criteria pollution that is literally killing people today. I would also add that we can't forget the economic costs of when we become too myopic in the range of fuels that we can use. We see that in the diesel prices that we have in the country today because of the situation in Ukraine. We saw that last year in Texas in February with the deep freeze. If we don't have a diverse range of domestically abundant energy solutions, those energy costs ultimately get passed on to consumers in the form of higher prices. And ClearFlame, by using domestically produced fuels, we can avoid those challenges and insulate ourselves from geopolitical risk. And the final area I would say is, let's not forget the core competencies that this country already has. There are over 250,000 people in this country that are diesel technicians and diesel mechanics. They can have their core competency become compatible with a sustainable future just by using technology like ClearFlame and using that decades-long expertise to still create high-quality advanced manufactured engines, but in a way that's not reliant on fossil fuels. I think that's important for protecting jobs. It's also important for educating people on the message of the climate transition, which is if you give someone the choice between protecting the climate and keeping their job and putting food on the table for their family, I'm privileged enough to not have to make that choice, but I would challenge anyone that you can't fault someone for choosing the latter if that's the only option they're given. And so by taking the jobs that are already out there today and figure out how to translate that competency into something that is sustainability focused while minimizing the level of retraining, that's going to protect jobs and also reduce the barriers to get people to buy into the energy transition movement.
Thanks, BJ. Making that connection between climate and jobs so critical in kind of being able to solve both those problems at once. Dan, how about the chamber and your member companies? What other types of impacts are you seeing you making a difference in beyond climate?
Yeah, I'm not sure if this will exactly answer the question, but I think the observation I'd like to share on that is that we're seeing kind of a new era of partnership and collaboration that's probably stemming from all of the net zero commitments that basically every company has made as they're starting to look, okay, what's my pathway to actually achieve this and meet the midterm goals, et cetera. I think they're realizing that you know that pathway is a lot more complex than maybe the expertise that they would have in their company. And so you're seeing a lot of really interesting partnerships between companies to try to solve these problems. And I'll just cite off a few examples. There's dozens of these that have all been announced in the last 6 months. One, Chevron has announced a strategic partnership with both Toyota and Cummins on low carbon transportation solutions. I think it's mostly hydrogen based. So you have the world's largest, or at least the world's most valuable automaker, one of the world's largest diesel engine manufacturers, working together with one of the largest integrated oil and gas companies and saying, look, we probably can't do this alone. We need to work together on this. And the sum is greater than the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. Another, we've seen refiners work with the airlines to develop sustainable aviation fuels and think about the pathway for that. One of my favorites just a couple of months ago, and this could have been, I think, in some sense, accelerated by the recent legislation. Dow has announced a partnership with X Energy, which has a high temperature gas reactor, small modular reactor that's very flexible to essentially produce chemicals with nuclear energy, which is really interesting. Also, on BJ mentioned the local pollutants, and so this is a way where you can have much cleaner local energy production for industry. So there's just an incredible amount of collaboration going on that was not going on before. And the final one I mentioned is it's also happening at the government level, and we're seeing that as when DOE has $8 billion in hydrogen hub money. A lot of states are working together, and there's a lot of examples of this. But one that comes to mind is you see two blue states, New Mexico and Colorado, have signed an MOU with two deep red states, Wyoming and Utah, to say, look, let's work together on hydrogen. We all have sort of different skill sets and economies, and let's collaborate on these hydrogen hubs. So there's a lot of that going on that I think is pretty exciting and goes well beyond just kind of the direct emissions reduction goals.
Thanks, Dan. Some great examples of some partnerships happening there, of people coming together to solve this problem. Rick, let's go to you on this question. What are the types of benefits that your members are delivering?
Yeah, well, quite a few, but I'd like to probably hone in on leveraging the value in our existing infrastructure. We have about 2.5 million miles of pipeline in this country that today delivers natural gas, but is able to deliver other gaseous molecules as well. And being able to leverage that infrastructure and working with our communities to actually gain economic value from that. I'll give you an example. One of our members up in the northern part of the country was working with one of their larger cities who was facing some economic development constraints because of the capacity constraints they had on their sewage treatment facilities. And they were looking at a number of different opportunities to overcome that constraint, including building a new facility. But what they were able to do is work with our member to actually be able to put anaerobic digestion in their existing facilities that enable them to expand the utilization of those facilities and be able to utilize that anaerobic digester to produce renewable natural gas that could be injected into the gas pipeline in the city and be delivered to the city's transit fleet to run on RNG and other RNG that could go to large industrial or commercial customers. So actually leveraging that existing infrastructure to actually accomplish a number of objectives: economic development, managing waste streams, utilizing the gas infrastructure, and delivering low carbon fuels to customers in the region. I guess that would be a win-win-win-win. So I just think that there's plenty of opportunity to leverage our existing infrastructure, including our gas infrastructure, to achieve these goals that we've all been talking about.
Thanks, Rick, for sharing that example. Yeah, I think as many wins that we can stack on each other, it'll make things easier all around. So we only have a little time left, so we're going to jump into some of the audience Q&A that has come in. So one question that it looks like has been voted to the top here is about hydrogen and getting your thoughts on kind of the uses of hydrogen. Do you expect things like rail and aviation will become more substantial as costs come down, as opposed to industrial heating? Do you think hydrogen has a shot on using as energy storage versus other energy storage technologies? Would love to hear the panel's thoughts on that. I don't know if anyone wants to jump in and share their thoughts on hydrogen end uses.
It looks like I'm still on camera, so maybe I'll jump in and start.
Go for it, Rick.
There is a lot of momentum that has been developed around hydrogen in just a short period of time. I've been at the development of renewable natural gas for over 10 years, and we're just starting to see that momentum. Hydrogen has leapfrogged that in just a short period of time. But there's so much that needs to be done in the way of research and making sure that we're utilizing it effectively and safely. So right from production to distribution to end use, there's a lot of work that's taken place, and kudos to the Department of Energy to actually jumpstart a lot of this work. So there's an awful lot going on. Are we able to economically and efficiently and environmentally produce hydrogen and safely deliver that to the market? And how can that be used by the end use customers? There's a tremendous amount going on here. And I personally believe that there are going to be multiple ways to utilize hydrogen. It can be blended into a certain level into the existing gas pipeline system that can be delivered to the end use customer as a combined molecule with other fuels like RNG and even geologic natural gas. There are going to be instances where technology may allow the production of hydrogen to be located close to where there's a large demand from an anchor customer, like an industrial customer, that can have a dedicated hydrogen pipeline that could have 100% hydrogen flowing through it to serve that industrial customer's needs and help them achieve their environmental goals, while also maybe utilizing that same pipeline to connect other customers along the way, large commercial customers, or perhaps even large residential development. So there's an awful lot that hydrogen can accomplish, but we need to do this smart and really understand where the opportunities and where the limitations are.
I would also like to add that. Oh, sorry. That there's a spectrum in use, and I believe very strongly that hydrogen has the ability to be a Swiss Army knife. But just like a Swiss Army knife, that tool works better in some applications than others. And when you look at all the things that we can use hydrogen for, there are so many low pressure industrial processes. To use the example Rick that just gave, putting it into a pipeline and distributing that pipeline infrastructure pressure with the infrastructure we already have is going to be cost effective far before having to cram it into, say, a truck for mobile applications or an airplane. And so as we begin to scale the green hydrogen economy, being cognizant of that supply will be somewhat limited and using it where it's actually most cost effective and most needed, not trying to shove the round peg into the square hole let's use it where it's best first and acknowledge that we need other solutions to complement those mobile, high energy dense applications where it's farther away from being economically and technically viable.
Thanks, BJ.
I agree completely
Additional
with
thoughts?
Rick and BJ. Oh, sorry. I was just going to say I agree completely, and I think there will be that kind of stepwise application build out, and that's probably why, back to our earlier point, it's so important to make sure the implementation of these laws is done in a tech neutral manner, so that one application or another doesn't sort of get the edge, and the market can decide.
Great, thanks everyone. Maybe we'll jump to another question, try to fit another one in here. This one has to do with CO2, another technology area that multiple folks brought up on the panel as a key one. Here, asking specifically on the pipelines that are proposed in the Midwest Summit and Navigator. So maybe some general thoughts on kind of CO2 infrastructure, what's kind of the need there, and kind of this redundancy of the two pipelines, or is the capacity needed? Maybe general thoughts on your thoughts on the CO2 infrastructure needed to really use CCUS in some of the industries we've been talking about.
This is one
Guess I
that's
could
very near and dear to my heart. Oh,
Go
please,
ahead,
Dan, go ahead.
BJ. No, go ahead.
Okay, so yeah, this as I was saying is near and dear to my heart because it is very tied to the ethanol production process. I think pipelines like that are going to absolutely be necessary. This country is blessed with tremendous potential to do geologic carbon sequestration, and sometimes you have to move that carbon from one location to another to make that happen. There are, of course, a lot of challenges with those pipelines, eminent domain issues, but finding some way to use that tool to take advantage of the geology we have, the carbon capture technology we have, and the processes that produce very high concentrations of CO2. If we don't find some way to marry all those things together, and pipelines are a good way to do it, we're not going to hit our climate goals. So challenges to be solved, but certainly a massive.
Yeah, and I was just going to kind of comment that we talked 5Q and the incentives that it creates, and I think some of the other remaining hurdles are more sort of soft policy, which is this citing and liability and eminent domain and all these issues are going to have to be overcome, and they're equally as important, even if they're not as kind of front and center. So fortunately, though, I think the agencies that are going to be overseeing this at least recognize that, as well as the stakeholders. So a lot of work is being done in that area.
Great, thanks, Dan and BJ. Rick, did you have something to add there as well?
Yeah, I'll just reiterate what I had mentioned earlier, that I believe that CCUS is a critical piece of the puzzle for decarbonization. I think it's absolutely going to be critical for us to achieve our goals here. And it's just not carbon capture. There is the opportunity to, as BJ was talking about, to store it and utilize it. And there are many ways to utilize carbon. And one example is producing hydrogen through electrolysis and using CO2 to mix it with hydrogen that'll allow it to be compatible with the gas pipeline system is a way to achieve a number of different objectives there. So I think it's a critical piece of the puzzle.
Well said. You can also use it to make advanced liquid fuels. Yeah, thank you, Rick.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I think we are running short on time now, so I think I better wrap up. Thanks so much to our four panelists for joining the conversation today. And thank you all in the audience for watching and for your wonderful questions. Clearly, there's a lot of interest here on hydrogen, CCUS, but then many other technologies that are going to be impactful for these hard to electrify, hard to decarbonize sectors. That all of you, your organizations, your members, your companies are working on together. great to hear too about all the different partnerships that are coming together, that, some of this legislation is really starting to accelerate. I think that's something we're all excited to see. So hope to continue working with you all and those in the audience on this critical issue. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you, Abigail.
Thank you all for joining us for the second day of the National Clean Energy Week Policymaker Symposium. I'm Brian Wolf, Chief Strategy Officer for the Edison Electric Institute. And as you all heard this morning from EEI Chair Warner Baxter, we are in the middle of a profound long-term transformation in really how energy is generated, transmitted, and used. And we are laser focused on making sure our customers are benefiting from this transformation. We're not just transforming how we make electricity, we're actually innovating across the industry, making it possible for other sectors and industries to really follow our lead. Driving innovation really is the key to the transition to a clean economy, one that's really equitable and has broad benefits for both our customers and our workers. Really, the most obvious way that the transformation is really manifested to date is through the truly unprecedented change in the mix of resources used to generate electricity in the United States. When I came to EEI, it was back in 2009, and more than 50% of our electricity came from coal. The energy mix has changed dramatically since then and is increasingly cleaner. And just 10 years ago, coal-fired generation had fallen to about 40% of the energy mix. But in 2021, last year, it was responsible for just 22%. And the share of electricity from zero emitting resources continues to grow. We all see that every day now. Renewable energy resources provide approximately 21% of the total generation in 2021. And that's pretty amazing when you consider that renewables were less than 10% of the energy mix in 2006, with the largest share from existing hydropower resources and just a slice from wind and solar. And today, when we add in essential zero-emitting nuclear energy, 40% of America's electricity is coming from clean, carbon-free resources, and that was as of 2021 last year. These changes really have had a profound, probably the decrease that we've seen in the sector in carbon emissions. It's been the primary greenhouse gas emissions associated with electricity production. And the power sector emissions were just 36 below 2005 levels as of the end of 2021, as low as they were in 1984. And as we heard really across the industry, companies are investing in this broad range of affordable, carbon-free technologies and approaches with the goal of finding the most cost-effective ways to deliver resilient clean energy to our customers. And we know that America's electric companies are really well positioned to continue to lead the nation's clean energy transformation, and we have more policy tools available than ever before. As Warner noted earlier, it's really truly incredible how many monumental pieces of legislation have been signed into law since we all convened for National Clean Energy Week just 1 year ago. The Clean Energy RD&D, the transportation electrification, and the resilience funds from the bipartisan infrastructure bill, the support for innovation for electric transportation and grid technologies we know from the CHIPS and Science Act, and then, of course, most recently, the clean energy tax credit and incentives together that are going to really help make this clean energy transition more affordable for our customers. And we all know now that implementing these new laws it's really going to take a significant amount of work. And EEI is already underway with coordinating and leading industry efforts really to implement the funding, working to ensure that America's electric companies and their state and local governments, that we're actually reaching out to those stakeholders and that they're ready and able to access and to use new federal infrastructure funds and these very programs that I just mentioned. And as we heard from DOE Loan Programs Officer Jigar Shah and the White House Senior Director for Industrial Emissions, Tricia Miller, we need to continue to work together to drive innovation. And it's so exciting that the Department of Energy has really been reorganized to unleash this American innovation. It's an exhilarating time to be a part of the industry, pretty fun for us that are really directly in the industry. And especially when you look at how our sector is really helping other major emitting sectors of the economy reduce their emissions, such as the transportation sector. Make sure to join us back here tomorrow morning for great sessions with industry and government leaders who will discuss opportunities to unlock American resources and innovation to help deliver a resilient clean energy future. Thank you very much for joining.
Thank you so much for tuning in to today's National Clean Energy Week Policymaker Symposium, where we focused on clean energy innovation. Join us tomorrow for the last day of the symposium, where we will focus on how we can unlock American resources to advance clean energy.